Just yesterday, Fallout 76 got a massive new update. For some of you, the download for this one was shockingly large, potentially between 70 and 90 gigabytes in total, although for me on Steam, I just had a mere 20 gigabyte download, and that large size was no coincidence, as you are literally reinstalling the entirety of Fallout 76, because this update shrinks Fallout 76's file size to about 95 gigabytes down from 105 gigabytes, but that did require reinstalling the entire game. And even from the onset, this update had some issues. It is called the Milepost Zero update, except Milepost Zero isn't actually here. As, yeah, right at the bat, the new caravanning feature, where you can basically launch your own caravans and build up a caravan company of your own, was delayed later into September. As of right now, no new release date has been shared for that aspect of the update, but it's just promised to be coming later this month. Caravanning was really meant to be the content side of this update, so its absence is definitely felt. But Fallout 76 still did get some massive changes with this update. The game is genuinely quite different now, and a lot of these will have lasting effects for years to come, although unfortunately not all of these changes were intended. So while I will be highlighting some of the major patch changes, first we have to talk about some of the unintended changes, as the community is quite up in arms about this update right now. What is easily the biggest issue with this update is the inability to loot enemies. In Fallout 76, when you initially take down an enemy, their corpse will fall to the ground, just like it works in past Fallout games. But likely for server performance reasons, that corpse will eventually convert into a meat pile, which then you can loot when you finish your event, your fight, or whatever. Those meat piles should stick around for quite a long time. So you'll have around 20 corpses on the ground at any given time, but an unlimited number of meat piles. And after most events, you'll find the ground littered with these meat piles. Except, for whatever reason, with the most recent update, that just isn't happening anymore. The corpses just aren't converting into meat piles, and since the corpses themselves do despawn, that means they're despawning, and you're losing out on all of the items that would typically be lootable. And yeah, in the live version of the game, unless you are going around and actively looting every corpse after it falls, you are very likely going to be missing out on some of that loot, because those corpses and those items will eventually despawn as more enemies are taken out. And during active events, this can be quite a bit of a problem, because of course there are tons of enemies all around. And it doesn't really seem like there's any exceptions here. If you take down a legendary enemy and don't actually loot their corpse before despawning, you'll just lose out on those legendary items. And of course, this is a massive problem, because looting enemies is a cornerstone feature of the Fallout 76 experience, and having to loot enemies as you fight is very far from ideal. But even separate from that, it seems like there's just a general loot not spawning issue, and I personally felt this while doing some of these events, where basically after taking down an enemy, they just don't have any loot on them, even though they should. You can find many users reporting the exact same thing online. Perhaps this is related to the meat piles problem, or it could just be a separate loot issue. But of course, this is particularly brutal when taking down a legendary enemy and not actually getting any items from that. Some users also reported this being an issue with dropped items from players not spawning in a loot bag. Thankfully, I didn't have this problem myself, but just be wary. A lot of the trading in Fallout 76 does occur by dropping items for another player to pick up, and considering a lot of those items can be incredibly valuable, I would avoid using that method until many of these bugs are resolved. Coming in at a close second, although thankfully not nearly as widespread, there's also some kind of issue going on with AP regeneration following this latest update. Tons of users are finding that their action points are just not regenerating as they're supposed to. I even noticed this myself during some events where things were clearly taking longer than I would have expected. Some users are even reporting their AP being locked at 0 until they leave the server, making the game temporarily unplayable. Because of course, your AP is used for almost everything. Things like VATs, sprinting, jetpacks, and even several perks are tied to having action points to spend. Although thankfully this AP bug is a bit more sparse and a bit harder to pinpoint. It's not happening all of the time, and plenty of the time your AP will generate just fine, but something definitely is going on. Some users are pointing towards certain perk cards, such as the dodgy perk, but at least as of right now, there's no consensus on what exactly is causing this. Power armor is somewhat bugged. There are reports that all of your armor and clothing is stripped from you as you exit power armor, at least some of the time. This would actually mark the return of an older bug, because this was a problem in Fallout 76 in the past, and while not the end of the world, it is a bit frustrating to constantly have to reapply all of your items. But even further, this getting stuck in power armor bug is very much so still alive and here. This happened to me even in just my first 20 minutes of playing. Upon getting into power armor, my game was temporarily soft locked. I couldn't open any of the menus, I couldn't even alt tab from the game, and I was about to control alt delete and shut down the process, but then thankfully the game recovered after a short duration. But obviously that's a pretty game breaking bug for the entire game to just freeze as you're entering into power armor. As we'll talk about a bit later in this video, legendary crafting was added into Fallout 76 as a part of this update. But it seems like things have maybe gone a bit too widespread with legendary crafting, as now some users are finding melee weapons can drop with the rapid reloading effect. Which, yeah, you can't actually reload melee weapons, so this effect literally does nothing and just becomes a wasted legendary mod slot. At least now with legendary crafting, you can actually replace some of these effects if you want to, but it's pretty unfortunate and definitely a new bug that seems to have just popped up after this update. And honestly, that's not even everything. Those were just some of the major bugs I could confirm, but there are a variety of other reported bugs around this update. Although thankfully, Bethesda has responded to at least one of these issues, saying on their Discord, the team is aware and looking into an issue with loot bags such as meat piles not dropping. Thank you for your reports thus far. We'll update you once we have more to share. So hopefully this does get addressed soon, because it really is quite a game-breaking problem. Not actually being able to loot enemies is pretty big. It's a multiplayer game. It's heavily reliant on the loot you get while playing. Although even outside of some of the bugs to pop up from this update, there's also just a lot of general user frustration around some of the newly added features and how exactly they're working. Legendary crafting is easily the biggest of these new features. You'll now be able to manually assign legendary effects to your weapons and armors, effectively being able to build out god rolls to your heart's content. But in order to do this, you'll first need to get one of these new legendary mod boxes. Once you have one, you can simply replace the effect on a legendary weapon using the mod box and some script. It's actually relatively cheap and simple to apply new legendary effects, but getting those new legendary effects will be a bit more cumbersome, as there are 3 ways to get legendary mod boxes for yourself. Scrapping legendary items is now possible at workbenches, and it's going to be the main way to unlock one of these mod boxes. As you scrap a legendary item, you'll get some script, but also have a 1.5% chance to just get a mod box for one of the legendary effects on that weapon. So here, I have a 1.5% chance of earning a singular mod box for any of these 3 effects as I scrap this armor piece. But to be clear, that's just a one-time use mod box. You're not actually learning how to craft that legendary mod. As separately, there's going to be a 1% chance to learn the plans for one of the effects on that item. Unfortunately, on this front, you can never learn more than one effect at a time, and this won't give you any new items. But you can see here, as I'm just going through and scrapping this item, I learn how to craft the 3-star strength effect. So then you could head over to the Tinkerer's Workbench and find that you can craft an unlimited number of this legendary mod box. It'll come at a cost though. Legendary modules will likely be the most expensive aspect of this outside of actually learning the plans in the first place, as most legendary mod boxes cost quite a few modules, but oftentimes one other miscellaneous item. Thankfully, to go along with this, during this update, many of the public events in the game will now reward you with legendary modules, so you'll be gaining more overall as well. But then of course, after crafting it, you'll be left with a mod box which you can apply to items. And this system can definitely be quite time consuming. Here I scrap a ton of legendary items and I only actually learn one plan, and I get exactly 0 mod boxes in the process. Funny enough, this is the exact same mod I learned when I did this on the public test server. So this is one of those systems in the game that's really going to be one of the longer term grinds. Like, it'll likely take months for you to learn the mods you want, and then even crafting them can get quite steep in the legendary modules department. Although there is one more way to get these, as thankfully legendary mod boxes are fully tradable. So just by searching some of the local vendors, you may be able to find some of these for yourself. Although sadly, these are under the general mods category as you're looking at vendors, so it's not exactly simple to tell if somebody's selling legendary mods or just regular mods. Overall, I think legendary crafting is definitely a positive change to the game. As months go on, I imagine buying legendary mods will become more and more accessible for most players, as well as just overall, there's going to be a far more directed path towards the god roll you're trying to get. It'll likely still take quite a bit of time to get that god roll, but at least you do have a focused way to get it. As a part of this, legendary cores are also removed from the game, and they should have been converted into legendary script on login, although some users are reporting that this bugged out for them also, and they didn't get any additional script from their cores. The other major feature of this update is best builds. So now, around the map, you may notice some camp icons are a bit more prominent. This is going to be a user-submitted best build that users likely not even on your server, and instead, hopefully a cool-looking camp will be placed down in a certain spot. The concept of this feature is really cool. Getting to see some of the community creativity on display, even without playing with those particular players, is a really nice addition. But at least as of day 1, this definitely has some issues right now. Many players are finding that these initial best builds aren't all that impressive, and since this will occupy a camp slot on that world, the location of that best build will be fixed there. Some other players with popular build spots are also finding it far more difficult to find servers where their camp can actually be placed down, as now a best build can take a camp slot over a player who is actually playing on that server. And there's some reports that this even extended to private servers, with some users finding finding best builds on their private server and in turn not being able to place a camp there. Although at least in my own testing, I was not able to recreate this. Best builds to me is a phenomenal feature in concept, and I think just a few revisions will make this one really nice. Because yeah, it does expose you to a lot more cool camps than you may typically see. But obviously, people who are actually playing the game on that server should take camp spot priority. Best builds shouldn't go on private worlds ever, and hopefully as players have more opportunities to like best builds or not like some of the mediocre builds, we will see a better distribution of truly epic camps being on servers. This update also contributed to the longer effort to rebalance pretty much all of Fallout 76, so you'll probably notice some balance changes to weapons, perks, certain armors, creature defensive stats, as well as offensive stats, and even some of the boss tier enemies in the game. Going over all of these changes could literally make up an entire video, but the major takeaways are damage over time weapons like fire and poison are partially reworked, as well as many creatures now have dramatically different resistances, so certain weapons will be far more effective against certain creatures now, but some damage over time effects were also just generally nerfed. I noticed lots of the higher tier enemies during events surviving far longer, and it was definitely far less of a mad dash to get a hit in on that boss tier enemy, although there's also a fairly large change to shotguns with this, and the Gauss shotgun received a fairly major nerf, to the point where many consider it unusable now. Overall, this update's definitely a mixed bag. These bugs are really rough, and it feels like yet another example of major unexpected bugs dropping with a Fallout 76 update. Fallout 76 has still not escaped that one step forward while two steps are taken back talking point, but thankfully a lot of the changes are very positive, and many of these changes are the type that will make the game more enjoyable over the long term. So hopefully once the bugs are resolved and part 2 of this update does drop, things are in a healthier spot than ever when it comes to Fallout 76. But with that in mind, check out this video to see the latest updates to Bethesda's other game.